I'm Marita Golden, and welcome to Creative Conversations. This is a series of dialogues, conversations that I'm having on a regular basis with writers, authors, creatives, and cultural influencers. It's my pleasure to introduce Lori L. Tharps, with whom I'll be having a conversation discussing the challenges of colorism in an increasingly diverse America. Lori is an associate professor of journalism at Temple University, the co-author of Hair Story, Untangling the Roots of Black Hair in America, as well as the author of Kinky Gazpacho, Life, Love, and Spain. Her book, Same Family, Different Colors, Confronting Colorism in America's Diverse Families, is timely, relevant, and a valuable addition to the growing canon of books examining the impact of colorism as a global outgrowth of racism. Lori, thank you for joining me today. I'm so glad to have you here.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I am thrilled.
This is a great book. And the thing I love about this book is that it's a combination of journalism, scholarly research, as well as personal memoir. So that the title may sound a bit serious, and like, oh, who is this book for? But I can tell you, this is a book for anybody who's interested not only in colorism, but in what's happening in society today, in America as well as the world. First, I'd like to ask you to share the incident, that opens up the book, because that kind of crystallizes what the book is about and how personal this book is for you.
Sure. And thank you for that wonderful introduction for the book, and for recognizing what it is, not just a memoir, not just nonfiction, but a real combination, which is what I think these kind of books and stories should be, is accessible for everybody to understand, but grounded in context and history, so people realize that something like colorism isn't just like a personal experience, it's a global phenomenon. So that being said, I didn't grow up really feeling the sting of colorism in any shape or form. But I married a Spanish man who's very pale, but comes from the south of Spain and has cousins who are darker than him. And I just assumed that our children would be brownish, but they didn't come out brownish. In fact, all three of my children were born with very pale skin and very straight black hair. I had two boys and a girl. My eldest son, I say ripened up, got darker by the time he was like 1 year old. His hair got very curly, his skin got very brown. And for all intents and purposes, he looked like a mixed kid or even a light-skinned black child. My middle son never really ripened up all that much. He stayed pretty pale, but his hair got very dark and curly, and he can grow a very big afro. So
Right.
There's not a lot of questioning once he got to be a certain age. But my daughter, who was born 10 years after my eldest son, she was, again, pale skin, very straight black hair, and she didn't get browner. Like by the time she was about 1.5, she still had like really pale skin. And I would say that her hair bent at the bottoms. Like there was no curl, there was no kink. And so we were sitting in a music school waiting for my older son to finish his lessons. And my daughter's just like crawling around, we're sitting in the hallway, and another man, a black man, and his daughter were waiting for their other child to get out of the music class. And the little girl and I were playing I Spy. And she said to me, "I spy something white." And before she had made up something, like she had said something like, "I spy something purple," and it turned out to be like a dinosaur behind me or something. So I'm guessing, making up things that she might have seen. And then she's like, "No, it's your daughter." And I was like, "What?" It just really threw me. And I was like, okay. And her father was so embarrassed, and he was like, picked her up and dragged her down the hall like a black father would do, like, "Come on," and I could hear her, "But she is white, Daddy, she's white." He was so embarrassed. I was embarrassed.
Right,
I
right.
picked up my daughter and I'm like, does she really look that white? But you know, children don't lie. They tell you like it is. So my daughter looked white, and there was nothing that I could do with her little bent straight hair and her, she was so white and had like pink cheeks. People had literally asked me at points if I had adopted her from China.
Wow.
And so that's when it really was like, color is real. Race is something that's on a card, right? It's on your government ID, but you can't hide what you look like. And that little girl just crystallized this point that when I walk down the street with my daughter, people are trying to figure out what's the connection.
Right.
People don't say that's a Black child or that's a mixed race child. They go, that's a white child or a Chinese child. Like literally, that's what people said out loud. So I can only imagine what they said in their minds. But the point was, we are a visual species. People look at you and judge you and understand you based on the way you look. And so the color of our skin, our features project a certain identity. And that is going to directly impact how you pass through life. And so that's when I was like, let's dig through this, because this is not just, I'm embarrassed, this was a funny thing. It really made me really think this is impactful and we need to talk about it.
Let's talk about what we mean when we say colorism, because one of the interesting things you do in the book, and then we'll go back to how you navigated in your own family, is that, you know, we think we know what colorism is, particularly in America. But there are a lot of myths that African Americans have about how colorism operates, who imposes colorist views. So let's start. What is your definition of colorism?
Right. I think colorism at its most basic is treating people based on the color of their skin, treating them, giving people preferential treatment, I should say, based on the color of their skin.
Right.
But the caveat is not, and this is controversial, some people think it's where light skin is preferred over dark. In the United States and mostly globally, it is true, because we live in a world that is predicated on white supremacy, that preferential treatment is given to those with lighter skin. But at its most basic, the definition of colorism, there are people who are discriminated against because of their lighter skin tone as well. And so the power dynamic is a little bit different in the definition, but I don't put the power dynamic in the definition of colorism, because we know empirically that people can be discriminated against for lighter skin and darker skin.
Yes. How do you navigate, you know, your family is typical of a lot of families in America. You know, we often talk about we're a nation of immigrants. Well, we're a nation of people who were kidnapped. We're a nation of people who were here originally, and then everybody else is an immigrant. And we've had waves of immigration, up and down, and colorism has always been a part of that. So now we're experiencing, you know, those people who are at the southern border, people who take a plane from China or Australia or wherever. So we're in this state of sort of racial and ethnic flux. So how do you navigate in your family the differences? How do you raise your kids differently based on their color? I'll just ask it.
Right. So that was the kind of question I was trying to answer in this book, you know, fundamentally, because I felt that if you could answer that question at a kind of a micro level in the family, then we could extrapolate and try to figure that out at a social level for the larger society. Personally, after writing this book and doing the research, what I realized is that ultimately I'm not raising my children differently because they have different skin tones. I thought I should, because I have, and this this questioning actually began when the Trayvon Martin was murdered.
Yeah.
And I have two boys, one who's darker, one who's lighter. And I had to ask myself, do I raise them differently? Do I give one the talk and the other one I say, you're free, you're fine, you go wear a hoodie. The other one, don't you wear a hoodie out the house, right? That was a real decisive moment for me of, again, that reckoning. What do I do? And again, that's, as a journalist, when I have those questions, I think I should write a book. I should, do a story on this and see how other people are handling it. So ultimately, I raised my children. My boys in particularly, because again, my daughter came 10 years later, but I raised my boys to both be Black men. They are Black men. And I mean, on a biological level, my middle son, who definitely has very pale skin, I think he looks Black. His features look Black. And how he's perceived, I can't be sure. I don't know if somebody's going to look at him and say that's a Black man. They may think he looks Arabic. They may think he looks anything, but he doesn't look white. He doesn't look like a white Anglo-Saxon person. And I am proud of being Black, and I want them to be proud of being Black. And I don't want them to walk around in fear. I want them to be aware that there are people in this world who will want to do them harm or who will dislike them on sight. But that's not the message I give my children. I give my children the message that they are Black men with a rich history, that they have every reason to be proud, but recognize the world we live in. I very much did not, I should say, let me reverse that. I found ways to praise each and every one of them for their uniqueness.
Right.
You've got this great, crazy, curly afro that just goes on for miles. It looks wonderful. The other one, I'm like, look at the way your hair your dreadlocks are gorgeous, and, each one of them, and we talk about their skin differences. We don't pretend it doesn't exist. We say like, yeah, your skin looks like hummus. Your skin looks like this, wow, you're tan. You look really good tan. Like, oh my God. My daughter just this morning made my heart sing. She said, oh, look, I'm already tan. I love being brown, and to me, I've done a good job then, because each one of them has a sense of who they are, what makes them special. They all know and I asked them, what do you guys call yourselves these days? Because it changes, but they all know they're Black and they know they're Spanish. And that's just who they are. And that's the way I've done it, is by making them very clear that Black isn't one shade.
Right.
And or one hair texture.
Right.
And again, because of the world we're living in, as you mentioned before, this is very obvious now, right? Yeah. I mean, Colin Kaepernick is like the same shade as my son, my middle son. Yeah. And he's Black. Nobody's questioning that, right? So I do feel lucky that we are in a world where, like you said, we're in a world of like ethnic flux, if you will. And there are images of Black at every shade. And so that's what's important, is not to, you're not quite Black, you're not quite this, you're better, you're worse, like this is going to happen to you, but not to you. We're all versions of Black.
I like that. I like that a lot. Just want to make a point here. Let's, for those of you who just joined us, we've asked that you not post in the chat or raise your hand, but we will have a period for questions. So if you have a question, you can post that in the Q&A section. I wanted to ask you now, you've said that you felt that with the changing demographics of the country, this has added urgency to this discussion, and color is more important than race. I mean, for example, we have a huge Latino population, more and more Asians. Talk about the ways that immigrants bring their own colorist histories to America, and that interacts with our own colorism, like Latino and Asian.
Very good. Yes. So one of the reasons that I wanted to do this book is because people often think that colorism only impacts the Black community. A lot of people think it's an insular thing that happens within the Black community. In fact, if you look up a lot of definitions of colorism, they talk about it as if it's an intraracial phenomenon that afflicts the Black community. Team light skin versus team dark skin, when in fact, colorism is a global phenomenon that affects anybody who has melanin, which even white people have melanin. And if you go back far enough, the most early incidents of people dying from arsenic poisoning because they were lightening their skin were white people. These were in the United States. I mean, if you can go back to Elizabeth, I think the first, she died of arsenic poisoning from all the white paint she put on her face. But in the United States, the first examples of death from arsenic, because arsenic was what people used to lighten their skin, were white women who had to work outdoors. There was such a fear of being seen as dark that white women who had to work in the fields would use arsenic based materials to lighten their skin. Don't want to have a red neck, don't want to have brown in your cheeks. And this Kathy Pice wrote in her book, Hope in a Jar, when she did this great biography of the beauty industry. And that's who was dying to be white, because lightness is not something that only Black people wanted. And so in my book, I talk about how, colonialism in Latin America really set the stage for people in Latin America to really have a almost it's a what's the word, a innate trauma associated with being dark, because of how fixed this color hierarchy was in colonial Latin America, such that based on the color of your skin, you had to pay higher taxes, right? The darker you were, the more taxes you had to pay. Jobs you could not have. I mean, there was a real penalty to being seen as darker, which would mean, the darkness was your association with African or Native populations, right? So Native, Negro, Native, these were like the lowest levels of the totem pole. But the Spanish married, like the Spanish were making families with other Black people, with Native people, and they had a hierarchy that was designated, a caste system is what they called it. And it was like there were over 20 different caste types. And what the encouragement was to marry up, marry somebody lighter than you, lighten yourself. And that system, that caste system, continues today. And today, in modern times, and the language that was used in colonial Latin America is still used today. I mean, mestizo, mulatto, these were all terms that the Spanish created to designate where you fit into this social hierarchy. And again, we're not talking about beauty. We're talking about, what jobs you were allowed to have, if you could have belonged to the church or not, if you had to pay higher taxes based on your skin tone. And it was about originally, if a Black person married a European, that was a mulatto. And there were these terms, but over time, we don't really know what your background is. We just are looking at your skin. We're looking at your hair texture. Indio, there's cambuzo, there's all these terms, and they're very derogatory terms, but nonetheless.
In Brazil, they have 100 different definitions.
Yes, the Portuguese were even better, and these terms they're quite poetic, actually, but they were never official, right? I mean, it was never codified into law, and yet, imagine when tax time came, somebody's looking at your skin to tell you how much taxes you had to pay. I mean, that's crazy. But the point is, the message has not been diminished. It is still, I just was asked to speak in a documentary about colorism in the Dominican Republic. And it broke my heart. I mean, this is literally interviews being done today where darker Dominicans were saying how my parents told me I had to marry a white girl. I had to marry a white girl so I could fix the race.
Right.
This is today. This is 2021.
Have you seen the films of women in Jamaica who use lye on their skin, wrap their skin in saran wrap for several days to peel off the top layer. And what happens is that when they are lighter, they have more people come to their stalls in the marketplace. They get better jobs. So the mutilation of their bodies actually does have a payoff.
And that's why this, in the book, I'm trying to show that this is global.
Yes.
This is not about beauty. This is, like you said, it has economic implications, survivor implications. And to your question, like you just mentioned, I just mentioned the Dominican Republic, you just mentioned Jamaica, and in Asia, East Asia, Southeast Asia, all of the places where, the majority of immigrants come to the United States have their own brand of colorism that in certain countries, it comes from colonialism. In other countries, it comes, like in East Asian countries, the idea of being lighter skinned is nothing about colonialism, because these were not countries that were colonized by Europeans, but there's a sense of class that is connected to kind of like the poor white peasants in the United States, not peasants, whatever we call them, whatever, right. Poor white people. And, but in East Asia and Korea, China, Japan, the idea that if you were wealthy enough to not have to work outdoors, you could keep your skin nice and pale. And so if you had to work out in the fields, you had darker skin. Now, outdoor working in the fields just meant you were a farmer. You were, it didn't mean anything like you were owned by anybody, but still the association with outdoor workers were that you were uncivilized, you weren't educated. Right. And those ideas continue today. Like your book title, Don't Play in the Sun. I had many Asian people tell me how their mothers would tell them the exact same thing. One woman from Southeast Asia told her mother would only let her ride her bicycle at night because she didn't, when she was a child.
Right.
Because she didn't want her to get dark.
Exactly.
And so when you have people who are coming from the other countries continuously with these ideas, fix the race, you got to marry a white girl, fix the race, don't play in the sun because you will be thought of as a peasant. And you come to the United States where Black people and anti-Blackness is so much in part of our society, those messages come together. And this idea of darkness and Blackness just is exacerbated, which is really unfortunate, because it's like we're doing the work, we're trying to do better, but where there's a constant influx of people coming with the same idea.
It's a poisonous belief, so that we have our poison, then immigrants come and they add their poison to it. I'm going to ask you a very blunt question. Since we're talking about color being more important than race.
Yes.
I think that the election of Barack Obama and Kamala Harris's ascent is a commentary on that.
Absolutely.
Could Barack Obama have been president if he was darker? Could Kamala Harris have been vice president if she looked like, if she was a skin tone of Stacey Abrams? Let's talk about that for a moment.
Right. I mean, I don't remember which Black politician it was, but that threw out there. I don't know. I don't want to name names, but I know that was often said. If he had been darker, he wouldn't have been where he was. I mean, I don't doubt that for a second, that his skin tone made him more palatable to a lot of people, Black, white, and other. Like, make no mistake, this is not let's be clear that, and this is why I say colorism is an issue that everybody's implicated in. Like you just mentioned about the Jamaican women, more tourists come to their stalls because white people feel comfortable with people who look more like them. But at the same time, people of color have been brainwashed into believing that lightness is better also. So people think Barack Obama, there's just a visual association with light skin, with professionalism, with intelligence, with worth.
Yes.
Same thing with Kamala Harris. I don't know. And the thing about colorism is that it's so deeply ingrained in our cultural values that I think many people would scoff, like, it has nothing to do with that.
Right.
And yet if you put Barack Obama and you gave him like a darker skin tone, I mean, because this has been done in so many studies.
Exactly.
Like you show them a picture of 5 people, different skin tones, and people automatically, you say, which one is smarter? Which one is this? Which one is that? And people inherently just, I mean, Black people, white people, I mean, Harvard has done this implicit bias test, you know, for years now. And absolutely people's like natural inclination is to, she's prettier, he's smarter, whatever it might be. And like, yeah, I don't doubt for a second that their lightness is makes them more palatable.
Right.
That being said, I don't think it's like, I don't think that we should look at that as problematic unless there was a darker skinned candidate who was overlooked, who was equally qualified. Do you see what I'm saying?
I see.
That, like, let's not diminish the worth of these 2 people. Not to mention, Barack Obama and Kamala Harris are 2 highly intelligent, highly qualified people.
Yes.
And to suggest that they only are where they are because of their light skin, then we're getting into that, like,
that's a form of discrimination. That's a form of reverse colorism. Now, one of the things you talk about in the book that is fascinating is you talk about color historically being something that was considered dangerous.
Yes.
Having too much color. And you told the story about Cleopatra. We were talking earlier. You share the story about Cleopatra, baby and
so, so my original, when I was doing the research for this book, you know, I really wanted to see, where does this come from, this inherent desiring of lightness, you know, because it predates colonialism, it predates slavery. So it goes back thousands of years that ancient civilizations were already keening for a lighter skin. I found that Cleopatra apparently bathed in ass's milk because it was thought to lighten the skin. I found that there was an ancient Chinese empress who used nightingale excrement. So the poop of nightingales on your face apparently was a lightening treatment, which I found out. I did a talk and somebody told me that nightingale excrement is still in some of these lightening lotions today. It's got a Latin name, you know, they don't use nightingale poop, but if you understand like Latin, that's what it is. Like, you're like, wait, what is this ingredient here? It's actually nightingale poop. But so like historically, we've known that people have been like looking for lightness. Now in China, this and I found most of my kind of this idea of wanting pale skin. Like, I found ancient poems about beautiful Chinese women that compared them to the moon, right? And so there did seem to be just this inherent idea of beauty with this translucent, like a pearl, like the moon, that was about beauty in East Asia, for example. I don't know in other cultures where you had darker skin tones, why lightness, except, you know, this connection with like the sun, God, lightness, brightness, brilliance.
And the fear of the dark, the fear of night, the fear of darkness, because it's mysterious, because you
can't,
and unknown.
Exactly. And the idea of color, though, was also very interesting to me, that people feared color, that color was like bright colors, dark colors, rich colors, were there, chromophobia, that's the word. Chromophobia, that people like even demonized people who would maybe paint their houses a certain like color. That there was a real sense that was associated with frivolity, with the devil, with not necessarily the devil, I shouldn't say that, but being non-pious, right? So being godly would be being pure and white and simple, and color was like showing off. And that was whether it was in clothing, whether it was in your house, that there was a true sense, and this is mostly in the Western world, but there was a true fear this chromophobia, and those who showed off with colors were
Right.
shunned.
Exactly. I mean, my mother always told me not to wear red, you know, not to wear bright colors. Now, I was raised in a household that was colorist, and so I assumed that because I was brown, those colors would draw too much attention to me, and as a brown person, I should stay muted. So it's a whole thing about what you wear, you know. Very good. Now, before we take a couple of questions, there's two, or probably at least two schools of thought about how we combat colorism.
Yeah.
One school says, okay, it's just a matter of raising your kids right, so that no matter what color your kid is, you talk to your children about how dangerous and how wrong colorism is, that they should not be colorist, and that will be enough. Then there's a school that says, well, no, that's not enough. We've got to talk about colorism the same way we talk about racism. We need social policy. Maybe we even need laws to acknowledge that colorism impacts people's salaries, their outcome in the justice system. So where do you come down on that? And why is it so hard to talk about colorism versus racism?
Yeah, so doing this book actually surprised me, because I thought colorism would be easier to talk about than racism, because it's so obvious, right? You can't hide it. You know, you're dark, let's talk about it. You know, you're light, let's talk about it. And yet people were just as reticent to share their experiences or their thoughts, or to even acknowledge that there was a difference. No, I mean, we're all black, right? We're all this, we're all that. Personally, I think that, you know, I say this in my book, and you mentioned it earlier on, that the conversation needs to shift towards talking about colorism. We can't talk about colorism without talking about racism. Like, that's kind of the underlying principle with which this country particularly was founded on. So it's part of the conversation. But when we talk about racism, we eliminate the opportunity to involve everybody who's part of this melanin conversation. When we talk about racism, we eliminate the nuanced conversation that says, you know, Janet, who is black but is very light skinned, has blue eyes and naturally straight hair, isn't facing the same type of discrimination as Sharon, who has dark features, nappy hair, and just, you know, more African features, right? How do we make sure Sharon is being given the rights that she deserves and is not being discriminated against, if we're only talking about racism?
Right.
How do we make sure that Mai Lee, who is a Southeast Asian woman, let's say from Vietnam, right, is not being discriminated against because she's dark, right? And you know, they say, oh, the Asians are like, you know, we have model minority, whatever you want to call it, but this woman is being discriminated against constantly because she's got dark skin, right? She's not seen as anything but an immigrant or dirty or something like that because of her darker skin, that her counterpart, who maybe has, you know, much paler skin, doesn't feel that level of discrimination. So in terms of how we combat this, we've got to get this out of the closet. We have, first of all, we need to start having these conversations across cultures. We need to stop having it in ghettos of, well, this is a black person's problem. We need white people to recognize they are very guilty and part of the problem, because they are the ones uplifting or recognizing or hiring the person of color who looks most like them. And so the problem is, like I said, it's global, but the answer then has to be global. We've got to have everybody in on the conversation so that we understand, if we're talking about policy, may not be federal policy, but it might be policy in the workplace. You know, when we're talking about diversifying the workforce, And we're saying, well, we have to bring in more Black people. You can't bring all the Black people who look like white people.
Exactly.
Like, oh, look what we found.
Exactly.
Like, my husband looks like a white man, and he is a diversity hire because he speaks Spanish.
Yes.
He's not a diversity hire.
Yes.
Okay. He fit in so perfectly at the private. So they were like, oh, we got a good one.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
That doesn't count.
Well,
he's Hispanic, but he's not, that's not the point. So I don't mean to cut you off, but just the idea that we need to open up our diversity conversations, our discrimination conversations, to recognize that you can't just say, oh, well, we have some Latinos now on staff.
Right.
If that Latino looks like, Cinderella,
right.
Not to say that she doesn't deserve a job, but we've got to open up this conversation.
Right. And we have to be in the room when the definitions are made. If you don't have darker skinned people in the room when the policies about who's going to be hired are made, all the diversity hires will be lighter complexion. Let's take a couple of questions right now. Hello, Ramona, can we see some of the questions?
Okay, so one of the questions is, hold on a minute, let me flip to she actually wrote this in chat, so I have to go in here. So one of the questions is, she said, it's Dira. She said, this seems to be two different conversations on colorism. There is colorism within the Black community, and in the author's case, having a biracial, multiracial family and how they are perceived in the world by how they look and skin tone. I think they should be discussed separately. So what would you?
I mean, I think that the idea of, this is what I was saying before, is that colorism is a global phenomenon. And in my book, what I wanted to do is I talked about colorism in the Black family, in the Latino family and community, Asian American, and in the mixed race community. And, my conclusion showed me that, we're having the same conversations in every story. I mean, in every community. So it isn't different. It's colorism is colorism. It's discriminating against people because of their skin tone. And what people experience in the Black community, where again, a light-skinned sister is treated differently than her dark-skinned sister, is the same thing that happens in the Bangladeshi community. The dark-skinned sister is treated poorly and the light-skinned sister is treated better. Mommy is telling them, don't play in the sun. Daddy is maybe accidentally preferring or saying, oh, my pretty girl, and then there's my smart girl, right? All of these things are happening in the family, in the communities, and it's the same language, same kind of principles at work. And then the same things happen when these people, our people with melanin, go out in the world. And many times, and this is where I want it real quick, like darker skinned people tend to be discriminated against more so than lighter skin, but also there are situations where the lighter skinned person, this is a situation like in the acting community, but it's really one that's easy to say, that like the lighter skinned Black actress can't get the job because she don't look Black enough. Well, we were looking for someone who could really be Black, right? Or we were looking for a real Mexican. Actually Mexicans come in every shade, every shade. You got Afro Mexicans, you have very pale, white skinned, red haired Mexicans. And so this also where we expand our definitions, like please tell me, what does a Mexican look like, right? Do they all have brown skin and straight Black hair? No. And that is also like, we're living with such limited ideas of, well, you're not really Black. You're not really Mexican. You're not that enough. Enough is what that at the end of that sentence. So colorism is a big issue. And it has many facets, but it's the same thing across cultures. And we do need to be having the conversation in the mixed race community, in the Black community, Latino community, across communities.
Well, and just before we take the next question, one of my pet peeves when I'm looking at shows on television or wherever that feature, quote, Black children, is often that Black child is biracial.
Right.
or multiracial. And what it does, it really breaks my heart because so often the little
Yes.
black child who's looking at television never, a brown skinned child looking at television or wherever, never sees themselves valued. And it's almost signaling that the audience for this is white. And particularly with the male child, if it's a little black, quote, black boy, inevitably that little black boy will be biracial, will have light skin and curly hair, which makes the white audience feel less threatened by a black male, no matter what his color is. And I often think about little black kids looking, when do they see themselves loved and nurtured and, you know, the way parents feel about kids? But that's just my pet peeve. Second question, next question.
So the next question is from David W., who says he's a white man. And he said that he noticed that neither Lori or Marita has used the term fair.
Oh, yeah, I don't use fair because fair is so loaded, as in fair versus unfair. So for myself, I do not use that word fair. I will just say someone is lighter complexion, light skin. And I think that fair is a term that we're sort of growing away from using. So that's why I don't use fair.
I know fair is used very much in India. There's a product called Fair and Lovely, and it's been one of the most popular bleaching creams that has kind of captivated that country to idea that I want to be fair. And I think that is also a loaded term. And it's such that there is now a lot of activists in India. There's a hashtag movement and an organization called Unfair and Lovely, because it's not fair. And they're trying to reclaim that and really get people to think like there's nothing fair about the way we are. In India, again, like I was talking about in colonial Latin America, today in India, the caste system, which wasn't originally supposed to be based on color, it has been almost formalized to be such that the darker you are, the lower in the caste system you are, and the lighter you are, you're at the top of the totem pole, to the point where, when I doing my interviews, talk to women who left India, who were dark skinned, but were at the top, like theoretically their family came from high caste families, but they said, you're never gonna be able to survive in India. You'll never get a job. You'll never, even though you're highly educated, you'll never get a job. You'll never get a husband because you are dark. And therefore people will assume you're low caste. So go to America, make a life for yourself there. Even an Indian woman who had freckles, same thing. They were like, you will never, because they're dark, and you're not going to ever be able to get past level, D, because it's so ingrained. So that fair is really, there's a lot of euphemisms for saying light. And I think when we use euphemisms, we miss an opportunity to really talk about what we're talking about.
Right. Next question.
So with that, Dr. Johnson said, speaking of bleaching skin, could it have started in China in the East? And anti-darkness is huge in Asia.
I mean, like I said, I started this project really trying to get at the root of, where did this concept of keening for light skin come from? And I, again, I found it in ancient Egypt. I found it in ancient China. I'm trying to think of other countries specifically, but I could not date it starting here and spreading. There were different cultures that was part of the culture already. And there was no starting point. It just seemed to be part of that culture. And we know though, but influential, if you look at influences, we don't take, as a Western society, we're not looking at China, for example, for our beauty images, our beauty ideals. Our beauty ideals as a society more or less come from Europe, right? We have we have a very clear sense of what is considered beautiful in this country. It varies and changes over the years, but our aesthetic is pretty much European, with a little picking and choosing from, you know, other cultures. But for the most part, we are our beauty ideals come from Europe, or at least, yeah, from Western Europe, I would say.
One of the things that I found fascinating in the book that you talked about, and you talked very honestly about this in your own family, is the desire of children in mixed race, in multicultural families or mixed race families, of the darker children sometimes to actually want to identify with the darker parent and the experiences, the racial, ethnic experiences of the darker parent. And, you know, so I'd like you to talk about that. And you write very honestly, even about your own daughter. We started this conversation talking about your daughter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's definitely, I mean, this is, you know, when we talk about identity politics, this is what we're getting at, is that, and this is, I don't think this is just with mixed race families. I mean, this is something that, you know, why I wanted to do this conversation, why I wanted to do this book is because you can have a Black family where you've got a light mom, a dark father, and the kids come out, one kid comes out light, one kid comes out dark, and all different variations of that. And there is a intrinsic sense in the human psyche to want to belong, right? We want to belong, and we want to be seen as belonging to some, let's say, I say tribes, right? Like, people want to be recognized as belonging. And at our most basic, we want to belong to our own family. That's why transracial adoption can be so traumatizing, because, you know, you walk outside and nobody knows that you belong to your parents. Right. These are your people.
Right.
And so when a mixed race family, if your kid comes out looking genetically different from you, it's the same thing. Like, I don't want people to question who this kid belongs to, and vice versa. No kid wants to walk around where people are like, is that your mom? You know, is that like, why don't you look like your mother?
Right.
That's basic. You know, my kids used to sit around, like, at times and be like, can I, you know, who do I look more like? They would hold up their hands next to mine or next to my husband's, and like, who do I look more like? And my daughter would really be desperate for my husband to be brown so he could be like the rest of us. So that's kind of a natural instinct, I think. And in this country, it can go both ways. I mean, I've heard really tragic stories of children who come from mixed race families, or, you know, again, like many Latino families, there's a lot of variation, where the child wants to look more ethnic because they belong, because they know they will be rejected by, like, they know they'll never pass as white. So it's not even about being rejected. It's just more like they can't get it. They cannot be seen as white. So they want to be identifiable as part of the community, if you will. But it can go the other way too, which can be sad. Like, I want to be white. Like, I want to be like daddy. I want to be like mommy. And or I want to be darker so that I can look like, you know, nobody's going to question my Mexican heritage. Right. And that's where, you know, I think this is not colorism and the discrimination, but it's color politics, in the sense that how do we make sure our children can feel that they belong to the group, even if phenotypically they don't look like that.
Right.
You don't look like a Black child. You don't look like a Mexican child. You don't look Asian. You got blue eyes. You know, how do we then decide, like, is their skin color going to determine who they can be, who they can claim? And
you said that people are just choosing their ethnic. The younger people are just choosing, no matter what I look like, I'm Black.
Yeah.
They're choosing to identify.
And luckily, we are now in a world where that is possible, with the caveat that you understand that outsiders may not see you the way you see yourself. And there has to be a real strong sense of identity that that's okay. I understand that people see me as a white person, or they see me as a, you know, yeah, a white person, let's say, but I see myself and I feel, and I've been raised to be, Black, and I identify with the Black community. And I think, we have to teach our children who may look more white, like, you can still be part of the tribe, but maybe you have a different role to play. Maybe you have to be more of an advocate for us, because you'll have people will listen to you more, and then you will use your power in that way. And these are the nuanced conversations that we have to have. We can't just be like, you're Black, you're gonna, because one, children will go out and try to, and they will find that they aren't treated the way they thought they should be treated. So, and again, that's why I'm saying we have to talk about color, not necessarily colorism all the time, but we have to talk about color, because that is how people judge us. That is how we are treated. It's because of the way we look. Because if my white looking child is given a great job and all these other things, it's because nobody knows she's Black.
Okay. One more, next question, Ramona.
So the next question is from Carolyn. And she said, please share some thoughts on the Meghan and Harry disclosure regarding her treatment by the royals. It was my understanding that the Brits were more class oriented rather than colorist.
That's a good question. That's a good question. I think there's a long history of racism in Britain that's hidden. Many of the people of color from the Caribbean, India, even themselves, they never really talked about or brought out the level of racism. So that just, for example, as a country like Brazil, for many, many years, oh, we're not racist, we're a great mixing rainbow. Well, that is not true. In Britain, they would acknowledge that they're classist, but never that they're racist. So what's happening is now that reality is coming out. Lori?
Yeah, it's coming out in Meghan's babies, like it's literally coming out. And I mean, I think you make such a good point, because the Brits have, like many European countries, have prided themselves on not being racist. And, they got a lot of their their populations of color to buy into that and say, as long we're all British. I mean, I got into almost a fight with a Black British woman because I said Black British, and she was like, we're just British. And I was like, oh, my bad. All right. I
drank the Kool-Aid.
Yeah, I was like, I mean, and it wasn't like it was just like, but anyway, so didn't go anywhere with that. But I think it is very difficult for people like the royal family who's on public display, because they've pretended for so long that they don't even have the language. Like, they don't know what they're talking about. They just know intrinsically we don't want a Black person because we're racist, but we have never admitted it. And we've even fooled ourselves into thinking we're all British. Like, look at our subjects. Look at our beautiful, colorful empire. But the reality, and they are classist and racist, but they are like 20 years behind, the United States in unpacking that. And so Meghan made them have to unpack it before they had the tools, before they were ready, and all they could say were like, what color are his ears going to be? Like that was slave conversations, right? That was, that was like maybe 100 years behind, not 20. And so it's just forcing them to have those conversations that, again, we in the United States have been having for a much longer time. And they just have to come to terms with it and recognize, and again, there's plenty of people in Britain. I've been to London twice in the last 7 years, and have really been impressed with the communities of color who are forcing these conversations and are coming to terms with and saying, wait a minute, us being silent about this hasn't really gotten us anything. Let's start really having these conversations. I was shocked going into British bookstores and not finding like the Black British section, or they don't even recognize it on the bookshelves that there's like an actual history or, canon of literature by Black British authors, or even Asian authors, Asian, where they mostly refer to Indian as just Asian. They don't even separate their books by cultures or races, right? So they have a long way to go to unpacking that. And I know in the United States, a lot of people are like, Megan's not even that dark. What is the problem? You would think that that wouldn't even be an issue, right? She's not like really, really black. So why are they having a problem? Which shows that it's race. Like color doesn't trump the fact that she's black. Like she is very pale for a black person. But that one drop rule is real.
The one drop rule.
It's very real.
Ramona, next question.
So David says, I wonder why you separated colorism and racism. Isn't the former colorism a manifestation of the latter, racism? It remains unclear how the separation serves us.
That is a very good question. They are very different, but the last part of your question, I think David was his name, so important. There's a really, really smart woman scholar, Dr. Yaba Blay, who just wrote a book called One Drop, and she was a guest on my podcast recently. And the question she said is, we can keep talking about colorism, but how are we going to, move forward? Saying light against dark, okay, we have the conversation, but what we should be asking is, who does it serve? Who does it serve to continue this idea of even recognizing that there is an implicit bias for light skin over dark skin in the United States, for example? Who does it serve to break us down into like categories based on skin tone? Only one person, and those are the white people in charge, right? Like the power structure. It doesn't serve anybody to separate people based on skin tone. It really doesn't. So we can keep talking about it, or we can dismantle it and, be a powerful group of people of multiple hues. But it doesn't serve anybody. And the difference between racism and colorism, yes, colorism, I think, would exist if racism didn't, but it might not be so significant. It would be more a conversation about preference as opposed to power. If we didn't live in a world that had a institutionalized racist structure, then you could be like, I like light skin, I like dark skin, I like my skin, and we're talking aesthetics, and that's it. So colorism becomes dangerous because we live in a society that has a racist a racist foundation that can, like Marita started, people are put in jail for longer jail terms because of their skin tone. They are not allowed to live in a certain neighborhood because of their skin tone. Again, because if you talk about race, like, again, you could be a light-skinned Black person and have a very nice, home and a good neighborhood because people don't perceive you as a dark-skinned African-American, for example, which is a bigger threat than a lighter skin. And that's these studies have been done across cultures. Latinos, African-Americans, Asians, across all these different cultures who have melanin, the people with the lighter skin have better outcomes in education, in living, mental health, physical health. So that's different than just talking about race, right? Because if you looked at you would see a line between dark skin, let's say African-Americans, Indian, Latino, then that would be a connector, and you would see a connector with light skin Black people, Latino people, Asian people, and you would see that there's a wealth gap there too, right? And that's not just race, that's color. So it's nuanced, right? It's different. It's not completely different, but there are different conversations that are that racism impacts colorism. Yeah, I think that's what I want to say.
I think one of the things that came out of the 60s was that we talked about moving from color to Negro to Black. I'm Black, I'm proud, in sort of the racial sense, but we never really talked about colorism. So we were willing to say we were Black, but as long as we weren't too Black, we theoretically Black, we militant Black, but we never really talked about colorism. That's why I'm so excited about, your book, as an addition to what is a growing canon of scholarly texts, articles, and general books for lay audiences about the global scourge of colorism.
And let me just say one last thing about that really quickly is that, when you talk about, well, what's the difference and why do we separate them? Because there's a legal case that I mentioned in my book about a Latino man who wanted to, I don't know if sue is the right word, but he felt he was being treated unfairly at his workplace because of his skin tone. And he believed he was denied a promotion by his boss because he was dark. He was Latino. And the judge threw the case out because he's like, you can't claim racism when your boss is the same race as you. So his boss was Latino and he was Latino. And so they were like, there's no case, like that's impossible. Mm-hmm. But the case they didn't understand that colorism is very real. The boss was a light-skinned Latino and he himself was dark-skinned. And he was like, he had all the proof and all this, so on and so forth. But the judge was like, that's not a thing. You can't be racist against someone of your own race. But you can be colorist. And that's why this conversation has to expand.
Lori, this has been a great conversation. We've got so many more questions than we have time for. And before we came on, you were talking about the book about bleaching, which is the book that sort of led you into this. There are so many permutations on this subject, and I'm really looking forward to your next book about anything, but especially your next book about colorism. So at this point, I want to thank Lori for joining us. I really want to thank everybody who joined us on Facebook, everybody who joined us in the webinar. And before you go, I want to let you know that the next creative conversation will be on June 12th. That will be a conversation with Leslie Youngblood and Caroline Brewer, two very successful young adult authors who took different routes, one self-publishing, the other traditional publishing, to find their audience. And they'll be talking about the revolution in young adult stories, particularly as it's being manifested in the work that Black writers do. For those of you who are interested in working with me, I have my last two workshops coming up this summer. On May 22nd, I'll be offering an agent-ready book proposal workshop. And in June, I'll be offering a 6-week advanced masterclass in memoir. If you're interested in either of those or both of those, visit my website, www.maritagolden.com. Thank you so much for joining us today. Please let us know your thoughts, any suggestions, and I look forward to seeing you the next time. Thank you.